Thank you for coming out on this rainy morning. Is this working, Brendan? Amy will come get us set up. I'll just speak a little louder so you can hear me until we get the mic working. We're delighted to have with us Professor Jennifer Graber. She's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and an affiliated faculty member of the Indigenous and Native American Studies program at UT. She has an interesting journey. She received a BA in music from Goshen College, and then went to the Candler School of Theology at Emory in Atlanta for her master's in theological studies, and then received a PhD in American religious history at Duke. So kind of an interesting background there. Her dissertation was published as The Furnace of Affliction, Prisons and Religion in Antebellum America by UNC Press in 2011. And her current book, The Gods of Indian Country, Religion and the Struggle for the American West, was published by Oxford just a few months ago in 2018. One of the reviewers of this new book, there we go, is Pekka Hamalainen, one of my friends who wrote this about it. In this important and much needed book, religion emerges as something quite surprising and new, as a tool of indigenous dispossession and as a means of preserving native sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The Gods of Indian Country uncovers the centrality of religion and what it meant to be a Native American in the 19th century United States, as well as the centrality of Native Americans in the history of religion in America. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Jennifer Graber. She's coming out. I'm not sure if she cheers for Texas in the NIT or Duke in the NCAA, but perhaps both.
I'm ready. Good morning. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for all of you who came out on a rainy morning. I want to thank the Charles Redd Center for the invitation, including their support for my research in the past. They've helped me do some archival research a few years ago on the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, which was for me a stepping stone as part of the process that eventually got me to writing this book. So I want to thank Jay and thank Brendan and Amy Carlin and Joseph Stewart, all for their help in making my visit possible. Thank you. I want to start with an image. A drawing of a shield belonging to a Kiowa man named Ga Kodal, or Crow's Neck. Kiowa shields, while certainly having important physical qualities that protected men from arrows and bullets, also had vital spiritual properties. A shield's sacred power was signaled visually through colors and symbols painted on them and objects attached to them. There was always a story behind a man's shield, and two stories circulated about crow necks. The first reached back to the year 1833. According to it, Crow Neck took the shield from Mescalero Apaches after a battle between them had ended. And in this scenario, Crow Neck would have noted something special about his enemy's shield during battle, so special that he was compelled to search it out and take it home after the battle was over. The second story, a little different, comes from the 1850s. It's a bit more typical of shield origin stories. In this one, Crow Neck was out on a long journey in which he met some Mescalero Apaches, didn't fight them this time. And during his time with them, he learned about their rites for ingesting peyote. Intrigued by this ritual, Crow Neck ingested the substance himself and received a vision with this shield design. He used the shield for many years, but later destroyed it after using it in a losing battle against other native enemies. Both stories circulated among Kiowas, and both included an explanation for how the Mescalero Apaches had come to practice ritual peyote ingestion in the first place. According to the two stories, an Apache woman had become lost in the desert. She came upon a cactus while searching for her brothers. The plant spoke to her, offering her aid as she searched for her family. The moon also reached out to the woman, teaching her the proper way to ingest the plant. She found her brothers, told them about this strange encounter, and initiated Peyote Rites among the Mescalero Apache afterward. Both stories provide an account of Mescalero Apache ritual, but only the second one details Crow Neck's encounter with this powerful substance, how it prompted him to dream a shield design that protected him for many years. This story circulated widely. When Kiowa elders saw pictures of the shield design many decades later, they claimed it was painted to look like the top of a peyote button. What's interesting to me is that Crow Neck's encounter with peyote, something his community clearly knew about, did not result in other Kiowas taking up the practice themselves. Indeed, Crow Neck's experience was not the only way Kiowas would have heard about peyote. They regularly engaged in trade and diplomacy with native nations in the borderlands which had strong traditions of ritual peyote ingestion. But peyote rites did not start among the Kiowa until at least the 1870s, and even those incidents were infrequent. Not until the 1880s did a substantial proportion of the Kiowa nation engage in the practice. This was several years after the 1867 establishment of a reservation for their people, several years after Quakers were sent to civilize and evangelize them, after the 1874-1875 Red River War, in which Kiowas and their allies tried and failed to drive out the Americans who had invaded their homelands. It was only after the reservation filled up with Protestant and Catholic missionaries and after American officials threatened to break up their communally held lands into individual plots. Only then did Kiowas turn to Father Peyote. I want to think about that shift, that transformation in Kiowa ritual life, and I want to think about it alongside several other shifts, including the rise of a Kiowa prophet who sanctified the people's armed rebellion, as well as Kiowa's earliest encounters with Christianity, particularly the experience of men imprisoned for their role in the Red River War. But Kiowas weren't the only one undergoing significant religious change. I also want to explore what happened to Quakers and other American Christians who had entered Kiowa lands to administer reservations across the American West. I'll talk about this set of shifts, or outright transformations, in Kiowa country in the 1870s in order to argue that religion mattered for Native people seeking to protect their kinship relations and their connections to land. And religion also mattered for those seeking to expand American settlement into the region, including a variety of Christian missionaries. So let me offer some background. The Kiowas traced their origins to the Yellowstone River Valley in what's now Montana, where they had lived for generations as hunters and gatherers. Like many other Native people, they migrated onto the Great Plains between the 14th and 18th centuries. As horses made their way up from Spanish colonizers in Mexico, a new form of Native cultural life developed on the plains. Kiowas and many others who had always hunted buffalo on foot acquired horses and adapted their hunting practices. New kinds of large-scale hunting were possible, and the buffalo became central to Native life on the Great Plains. And that included religious life, which I'll come back to in a moment. Kiowas did not stay in the northern Great Plains for long. The region was full of powerful Native nations, including the Lakota Sioux and the Crow. Being a rather small community, Kiowas struggled against their more powerful neighbors. And in the late 18th century, they migrated south to the southern plains, what we can now think of as the panhandle of Texas or Oklahoma. There, they made an important alliance with the most powerful Native nation in the region, the Comanches, and thereby gained security in this new place. If you're familiar with Pekka Hamalainen's The Comanche Empire, and Jay, you just mentioned him, you'll understand the kind of power and prosperity in which the Kiowas shared in this period. They were truly what many people call the Comanches and Kiowas on the southern plains, which is right about here. In this period, they called them lords of the plains. When Kiowas moved from the Yellowstone Valley to the northern plains, and especially after they engaged in the developing horse and buffalo culture, their ritual life changed. They maintained some of their earlier practices, namely the keeping of 10 medicine bundles. These bundles were engaged with and cared for as persons. Leading men consulted them in moments of decision and used them in rites of healing. Kiowas actually still possess some of these bundles. I can't share an image with them with you because they're not allowed to be photographed, I'm afraid, or studied by anthropologists or other scholars. So Kiowas brought the bundles with them, but added a whole new set of practices that were circulating among Indian nations on the Great Plains. They developed, along with their neighbors, an idea that a non-personified power circulated through the world. It became manifest in any number of things: the sun, the moon, the buffalo, certain places, sometimes human-made objects, and sometimes particular human beings. They called it dodo. Kiowas and their neighbors understood themselves to rely on this power. Invocations to this power, including the forms in which it was manifest, involved asking for pity, pleading for various outcomes, such as safety, health, offspring, making offerings as a sign of good faith, and vowing actions as a response to benevolence. While Kiowas developed a number of ways to engage this sacred power, this dodo, they learned an important communal format for this work from their Crow Indian neighbors. This was the sun dance. The dance was typically an annual gathering that involved a variety of ritual acts and communal engagement. The practice involved gathering Kiowas that were usually scattered in smaller bands throughout the summer hunting season. It mandated the construction of a central ritual space, which you can see right here. In English, it's sometimes called a medicine lodge. Participants engaged in acts of purification, including smoking and sweats. These acts prepared for the central ritual work of thanksgiving and sacrifice, performed in relation to the sun and the buffalo. Kiowa men fasted for 4 days and danced in the central lodge while staring at the sun. Women and children supported them from the sidelines. At the heart of this gathering was a new object, a gift from their Crow neighbors, something the Kiowas called the taime. And this is actually not an original taime, it's a recreation because the original cannot also be photographed. As with the medicine bundles, a special person kept the taime, related to it, and carefully brought it out for the sun dance. It was really cared for almost like a child, taken care of very carefully. Altogether, Kiowas engaged in a large-scale annual rite to thank benevolent powers displayed in the past, and they also asked for protection in the future. That future eventually involved contact with Americans. Kiowas did not meet regularly with Americans until the 1830s, when explorers began to move steadily through the region. And during that decade, Kiowas made their first treaty with the United States. Even so, Americans didn't figure much into their daily living. Americans only began to push into Kiowa country after the Civil War, as more and more citizens, including the president, began to envision a West in which Native people still lived, but on reduced lands so that settlers could move freely across the continent. As a result, U.S. officials began to make treaties that reduced lands of Indian nations across the West. Kiowas and their Comanche allies were among them. In 1867, Kiowas signed the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, an image of which is featured from Harper's Weekly. This is an artist's illustration of the negotiations for the treaty. And in this treaty, Kiowas promised peaceful coexistence with Americans, including Texans, which is no easy task in this period. They agreed to the establishment of a 3 million acre reservation in return for cash annuities and annual rations. And here you can see this is the reservation, and these are the lands that Kiowas throughout this period had traditionally moved over very freely. So it's a very massive reduction in their occupation of space in the West. The reservation's establishment initiated a new period of sustained contact with Americans. Of interest to us who care about religion, many of the Americans Kiowas related to in this early period were Quaker. And while Quakers are often known as a particular people for their theology and worship practices, the difference that mattered in this case was their Christian identity based on nonviolence, as well as their experiences with Native peoples since arriving in the Americas. This particular understanding of their past propelled them to join, if not take the lead, of a broader Protestant coalition to shape the direction of the federal government's engagement with American Indians. Quakers, like other leading American Protestants, aimed to civilize Native people, transforming their housing, foodways, family organization, political life, child rearing, and importantly, religion. They believed they were best suited for this important work. Even as Quakers sought to transform Kiowas, they were themselves transformed by their experiences in Indian territory. And I want to talk about what happened and think about the significance of these transformations. And then I'd like to turn back to Crow Neck's shield and the peyote practices taken up by Kiowas in this period as they struggled against American occupation. But I'll start with the Quakers, as they came into the situation with big ideas about how to transform Native people and garnered strong government support for their efforts. Quakers had formally engaged with Native nations since the colonial era, especially in Pennsylvania, where Friends, which is another name that we talk about with Quakers, where they had leading roles in government. Along with this practical history of engagement, Quakers also developed a fairly romantic reading of their relations with Native people. I think this image from the 1830s really gets at the heart of it. The Quakers are in the background, having a nice chat with Native people, and here are all these animals like all together. It's a peaceable kingdom that includes the animals, the English Quakers, and Native people. As indeed, they established mythic accounts of their long-established friendly relations with Pennsylvania's Indians. And as paintings like this show, Quakers viewed themselves as a peaceful people who did well by Indians. These stories were, of course, contrasted by their sense that other Americans, including some American Christians, had a much more troubled history with Native people. They found settlers to be selfish swindlers and easily prompted to violence. They considered colonial and later American officials to be corrupt people who rarely had Native people's best interest in mind. As a result, they offered their services to the government soon after the American founding. Quakers were some of the first Christian activists to establish themselves on or near the young nation's newly created reservations. Already in the 1790s, they worked on Iroquois or Haudenosaunee reservations in upstate New York. Of course, these were not the first missions to Native people. The colonial period saw a number of mission societies. But Quaker work in upstate New York signaled the society's willingness to partner with government officials to shape federal Indian policy. And with this view of their mythic past with Indians, and in light of their work with federal officials, Quakers constructed a sense of themselves as friends of the Indian, as Americans especially able and experienced to direct the nation's Indian policy toward a benevolent and enlightened end. And while they worked at this project in several ways prior to the Civil War, they did not find extensive opportunities to serve as the Indians' friend until after the war, when Americans turned their eyes to settling the West. As federal officials dispatched former Civil War generals to subdue Indian nations across the Mississippi River, Quakers not only voiced opposition to a militarized approach, they offered themselves as an answer to the nation's, quote, Indian problem. They concurred with the already circulating idea that Native people needed to be contained on reservations. But they added to it their recipe for turning these spaces into sites of Indian cultural and religious transformation. They created an Indian committee to lobby Congress and other federal officials, and in 1867 published a memorial to Congress, which they sent to various members. And I want to just quote from two parts of it. It's basically saying what they recommend. They want to assign to the Indians a number of fertile tracts of well-watered country as permanent reservations to be solemnly secured to them forever, that they should be, and I think the next word is really important, induced to remove to them. Then they will move from hunting to farming. And then they turn in this memorial address to members of Congress and other Americans. And they say, we ask that the Great Spirit imbue the hearts of all with humanity, justice, and mercy, and that white and red men live in peace and glorify God together, and invite God's blessing to us, to our beloved country, and to our posterity. Here we see that Quakers promoted reservations as places Native people could be persuaded to live, and once there, sites for bringing them into peaceful relations with their fellow Americans. Beset by criticisms of the Indian Bureau's corruption, President Ulysses S. Grant initiated what came to be known as the peace policy, and sometimes even the Quaker policy. The policy created a board of Protestant leaders to advise the Federal Indian Office. It also doled out more than 70 reservations to particular Christian denominations. Religious leaders then designated individuals to serve as reservation administrators or agents representing the federal government as well as their own religious body. So to be clear, the federal government basically turns over the administration of scores of reservations to religious bodies. and then the religious bodies named their own representatives to run them on behalf of the federal government. That's how Lowry Tatum, a Quaker farmer from Iowa with no experience in Indian affairs, arrived at the Kiowa Reservation in 1869. Tatum arrived full of hope. Here's one of the quotes from his early letters. After arriving on the reservation, he was writing home to his wife, "May God grant wisdom to federal officials that they may act as becomes a great and Christian nation to perform towards its long neglected wards." He administered a 3 million acre reservation with more than 5,000 native people living on it, and he aimed to transform those people culturally and economically. He wanted them to build permanent wooden houses instead of mobile teepees. He wanted farms instead of buffalo hunting. He sought to transform gender roles, assigning men to farming and women to a focus on home and childbearing. He also deeply desired to turn Kiowas from their communal and individual ritual practices to a focus on the Christian God as experienced in Quaker meetings. Tatum immediately realized how difficult it would be to achieve this grand vision. The material conditions were not favorable. Reservation land was not suitable for farming technologies of this period. Tatum initiated the planting of corn and vegetable fields for several years, watching as newly sprouted crops withered under the June sun year after year. He also struggled with inadequate supplies. Even though the federal government signed treaties promising substantial food rations, these items were often late, of terrible quality, and sometimes didn't arrive at all. And then there were the people. Kiowas had little interest in changing their way of life. The reservation's size allowed them to continue buffalo hunting. This ongoing activity required teepees quickly moved in order to follow the herds, so Kiowas worried about Tatum's plans for square houses. They also told him that corn was not suitable food for Native people. They said it was fine for white people, but it just didn't work for Native people. Hardly any were willing to send their children to the tiny Quaker school a colleague had started, and none of them expressed interest in Christianity. Indeed, Tatum watched year after year as Kiowas and their allies gathered together in the thousands to celebrate the Sundance. In response, Tatum switched up his strategy. His earlier attachment to persuasion faltered. When Kiowas refused to plant fields, Tatum withheld their rations, an action he had no authority to do. When Kiowas refused, writing to the Quaker Indian Committee, Tatum was upfront about his new approach. Quote, "I did it to punish them, and I believed it had a very salutary effect on them." Tatum also began to rely on soldiers stationed at the nearby fort. This action violated the spirit of the peace policy, which held that the Army had free rein to engage Native people who ventured without permission off the reservation. But only agents, representatives of religious bodies, had authority over Indians on reservations themselves. Just a year into his assignment, Tatum requested soldiers on every ration day. So here's a quote from a year later. He says, "The presence of troops, I believe, had a good effect." This is not your average Quaker talk. Rumors began to spread about Tatum's cooperation with soldiers. Quaker newspapers took note, and leading society members visited to check things out. They encouraged Tatum to seek peaceful engagement with Indians. And while a few expressed reservations about his tactics, they did not tell Tatum to change course. If the Society of Friends paid close attention to Tatum's work among Kiowas, most other Americans didn't, at least not until 1871. On a day in May, newspapers broke the story that several Kiowa men had left the reservation to raid for horses in the Texas Panhandle. They came upon an American wagon train, attacked it, killing 7 men. Incensed Americans held Quakers and their peace policy responsible. Newspapers recorded and supported a military response to the Kiowa attack. Here's a headline from the New York Times. And in this period, in the 1870s, the New York Times has a daily column about Native people and updates about violence between Native people and Americans on the front page of the newspaper. And here we can see there is a call for a military response to Kiowas and the sense that Kiowas are about to attack everyone throughout the Southern Plains. Tatum cooperated with this new call for militarism. The Kiowas who attacked the wagon train immediately returned to their reservation, where Tatum confronted them. The agent, a Quaker farmer and friend of the Indians, then requested soldiers from the nearby fort to arrest the suspects. A few days later, one of the suspects was dead, and 2 others were on their way to prison in Texas. Tatum's actions sparked significant debate among Quakers. Some came to his defense, including many members of the Indian Committee. They argued that Tatum had done the best he could and that friends outside the situation could not know the pressures he faced. They said he needed the military's help in order to protect innocent Americans. But some friends remained unconvinced and called on the society to abandon their participation in the peace policy. During my archival research, I found several letters in which people were writing into the Indian Committee from all over the United States, basically saying his cooperation with the military is a violation of our principle of peace. This is a letter from some Quakers in Ohio, and one quote from it: "The use of military force is a violation of the principle of peace, that the use thereof in the present instance was an act of war, resulting also in the destruction of human life." So they basically say if the peace policy requires soldiers, we as Quakers in principle cannot use it, cannot be a part of it. Quakers were forced to grapple with the peace testimony's potential limits. They wanted to get it right on principle to prove that nonviolence was the best path forward. But they also had external concerns. The spotlight was on them because of their national prominence in Indian affairs. With the Kiowa attack on the wagon train, peace policy detractors came out of the woodwork, giving voice to Americans willing and eager to employ force and violence against Indians. This was a real moment of reckoning for all American Christians who cultivated their identity as peaceful friends of the Indian. Quakers' struggle to employ the peace policy and defend it in the public sphere continued past 1871. Ongoing violent episodes between Native people and settlers or soldiers renewed the conversation over and over again, and Quakers continued to find themselves internally divided. Adjacent to the Kiowa's reservation, a Quaker named John D. Miles was the agent for the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation. He was working in 1874 when Native people from across the plains created a pan-Indian coalition to drive the Americans out of the region. During this conflict, which came to be known as the Red River War, Agent Miles not only invited the military to intervene inside reservation boundaries, he also joined a military party sent out from the reservation to round up Native people involved in the war. So that's like terrible Quakerness right there, at least according to some. Miles' actions sparked heated debate within the Society of Friends, and he eventually lost his job when powerful voices claimed that he had violated the principle of peace. But Miles disagreed, saying that his cooperation with the military actually worked toward peace insofar as violent Indians would be subdued. Through all of these controversies, Quaker leaders continued to insist that the peace policy worked and that they, as true friends of the Indian, were best suited to enact it. And while scholars have considered the long history of Quaker nonviolence, including its uneven practice in some historical eras, I think the Quakers' encounter in Indian country was transformative. While many Quakers had been chagrined when some of their co-religionists took up arms during the Civil War, it was a small and mostly internal debate. But the peace policy was national. It put Quaker nonviolence on a big stage, and the spotlight proved withering. Not only did Native people typically reject what Quakers offered, but friends in Indian territory sometimes found their Quaker principles compromised. If American Christians, especially Quakers, found encounters in Indian territory transformative, the same must be said for Plains Indian nations. And I'd like to turn to Kiowa experiences in this period. I see 3 main ways that Kiowa religion was transformed. And in order to explore these, let me remind you of what ritual life was like when Quakers arrived to the newly created reservation in 1868. As noted earlier, Kiowas gathered almost every summer for a days-long ritual event called the Sundance. They prayed, sought healing and blessing, practiced forms of self-denial, danced, and related to powerful objects. They focused on the sacred power manifest, especially in the sun and the buffalo. On a day-to-day level, Kiowas also had a range of other ritual practices. They consulted healers with special knowledge of herbal as well as supernatural remedies. They sought visions and dreams. They related to a variety of beings that they considered powerful persons, including plants, animals, celestial bodies, and places. They considered these things to offer protective power. Even as Quakers arrived and called for them to change, Kiowa ritual traditions continued. They practiced the Sundance regularly through the 1870s. But as tensions grew on the reservation, a new figure emerged among them. He followed a pattern of action seen throughout Native North America. Scholars often refer to these figures as prophets. I borrow a term from another religious studies scholar and talk about these events and their leaders as rectification movements. This designation signals the movement's intent to repair a situation out of balance, a situation typically found after colonial contact. Rectification movement leaders rise up not at the beginning of colonial encounter, but often a little bit further into it. They usually happen once the balance of power has shifted in favor of the colonizer. They arise when the impacts of colonial occupation have had overwhelmingly negative impacts on Native people. Leaders of these movements, which also include Handsome Lake, Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, and eventually Wovoka, the ghost dance leader, often attest to an illness or near-death experience which starts their movement. Or at the very least, they talk about having some sort of vision. In these experiences, they receive messages from supernatural beings, usually with directions about how to act in this colonial and dire situation. That message usually calls for rejection of the colonizer and all or most of the objects that the colonizer brings. The message typically also instructs a return to traditions practiced prior to the colonizer's presence, or perhaps an adaptation of those rituals. There is also often a promise of some kind, a promise of an improved situation, if not a wholly renewed world. In the 1870s, a few years into the encounter with Americans, Kiowas experienced their own rectification movement, led by a man whose name translates as goose flying overhead. He was already understood to be a man of power. He was known to have visions for his ability and for his ability to talk to owls. He had material markers of these encounters, including a painted shield and a teepee, designs of which came from visions. These are some drawings of his shield that he received in a vision, and it has an owl, which was considered his kind of protective animal here. I'll talk about the other side in a moment. His transition into a rectification movement leader came from ingesting substances promoted by the Americans, namely corn and melons. Quakers planted cornfields on the reservation. Without knowledge about corn and melons' growing cycles, some Kiowas ate them before they became ripe, and many became ill, including goose flying overhead. He became so ill that his family wondered if he had died. But he hadn't physically died, but was instead in a sort of trance. He claimed that owls came and spoke to him in this condition, and they gave him new powers, including the ability to heal bullet wounds and to predict the success of war parties. And here, that idea about him having the ability to heal bullets, this is a sign for a bullet in Plains Indian art. In short, goose flying overhead was given powers to make anti-colonial war against Americans. Around this same time, a similar leader rose up among the Comanches, the Kiowa's closest allies. In 1874, goose flying overhead persuaded Kiowa fighters to join an alliance to push out the Americans. He promised power over bullets and to predict successful battles. During some of the clashes with Americans, he spoke to owls to get instructions about strategy. Kiowa young men followed him all the way into a place in the Texas Panhandle called Palo Duro Canyon. And he assured the fighters that the owls had told him they would not be found if they hid here. But he was wrong. American troops captured them, and goose flying overhead was one of 27 Kiowa men sent to a military prison in Florida. We have to ask how this episode of Kiowa religion was transformed by colonial encounter. Indeed, goose flying overhead and other Kiowa men had long been recipients of visions and understood to have particular powers in regard to warfare. To my mind, the difference lies in his vision's explicit connection to the colonial situation. He claimed power over colonial objects, namely bullets. And he was hardly the only one. Native revitalization leaders across the continent made similar claims. Think of Lakota ghost dancers later in the century. In fact, scholars of religion in other parts of the globe have found evidence of similar phenomena in South Africa and China. In South Africa, a prophet that rose among indigenous peoples there said that guns would only be able to shoot water and therefore not have power over them. Experiences of colonization produced religious transformations among Kiowas and a host of other people colonized around the globe in this period. But Goose flying overhead was not the only innovator. He went to prison with other Kiowa fighters. This exile from Kiowa country initiated two further changes in Kiowa ritual life, one initiated by other Native people, namely Peyote Ingestion, and the other coming from the Americans themselves, namely Christianity. And I want to start with the latter. While Kiowas might have had some knowledge about Christianity because of the Quaker presence on the reservation, there was no active mission on their lands. The Quakers held Sunday worship, but mostly to serve American employees and soldiers. If Kiowas had not yet come into much contact with Christian practice, they did upon their arrival to a prison called Fort Marion, where they were incarcerated for 3 years as a result of their participation in the Red River War. Here are some of the Kiowa prisoners right after arrival. We're going to pay particular attention to this fellow right here. Among the prisoners was a Kiowa man named Zotam, which translates as biter. He and his fellow inmates experienced what became a kind of prison experiment. Unlike earlier prisons for Native people that simply held inmates until they received punishment or were forcibly removed from their territory, Fort Marion's operators took a different approach. If reservations were supposed to induce Native people to change, to persuade them, the prison would be a place in which they were compelled to do so. Fort Marion became a site of required transformation. So here they are when they arrive, here they are a few days later. The prison officer achieved this transformation through a strict physical and spiritual regime. He required a change of dress into American-style uniforms. He required haircuts. He also initiated a daily schedule that included military drills, labor for local residents, English classes, and chapel. Zotam and others drew pictures while incarcerated. Kiowas had a long history of representing their accomplishments, history, and personal memories through painting on animal hides. In prison, Zotam and others accessed paper, notebooks, and colored pencils. And in a foreign environment and in this forced new way of life, he drew things he remembered about Kiowa country. Here's one of his drawings. He actually recalled the Sundance Lodge, the medicine lodge, and the men in the center doing fasting and dancing. So while incarcerated, this was something that he recalled and drew and shared with other incarcerated Native people. He also drew the things he encountered in prison, including its religious aspects. He was one of several Kiowa artists that depicted chapel services. He actually drew a number of images of chapel. And I think it's interesting to note how tightly squeezed in all the Native men are. The prison chapel was only Zotam's first encounter with Christianity. Upon release, he was recruited into a homestay program organized by Episcopalians in New York. Here he is up with some other recruits in upstate New York. Again, Zotam worked and took classes and went to Christian worship services. His hosts intended to train him to be a missionary for his own people. He was baptized shortly after arriving in New York. This is an Episcopal newspaper which covered the baptism of 4 Native men. Later, he was ordained a deacon. So he spent 3 years in prison, 3 years in upstate New York being trained to be a missionary, and then he went back to Indian Territory. Accompanied by a white Episcopalian minister, Zotam was the very first missionary to serve on the Kiowa reservation in 1881. He got started teaching catechism to children attending the reservation's recently established school. He visited his relatives' encampments on Sundays and offered sermons in Kiowa language. Within a few months, several Kiowas, mostly teenagers and mostly Zotam's relatives, requested and received baptism. The white missionary who oversaw Zotam's work, as well as the mission on the nearby Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation, sent letters to New York proclaiming mission success. But Zotam's life reveals how such quick praise was perhaps unwarranted. While he certainly seemed attached to new Christian practices, Zotam also missed aspects of his former life. Indeed, soon after his return to the reservation, he attended a Sundance, even though the head missionary warned him against it. And within 1 year of his return, Zotam ceased his relationship with the mission altogether. He disappeared from American records for several years, only to pop up a few years later when he married a woman in a Christian ceremony. A few years after that, a Baptist missionary noted his assistance as she was getting started. In many ways, Zotam's affiliation with Christianity reflects what would become a common pattern of Kiowa engagement with Christian ideas, practices, and missions. He moved freely between various Christian forms. In fact, on this document here, which has the baptism list for a Baptist church, we see at the bottom that he got baptized a second time, a few years after his first baptism in New York. He also participated in older Kiowa rituals, such as the Sundance, as well as some new practices borrowed and adapted from other Native people. So this is a report written by a Kiowa Christian in the 1890s, and the report is basically informing some American officials that some Kiowas are involved in the ghost dance, including Zotam. So he's like, look out, Paul Zotam, who's a Christian, is ghost dancing. And here it says, Paul Zotam, not only is he ghost dancing, he is eating mezcal, which is what missionaries called peyote. So he was very flexible and moved across these various practices. And it's this last practice, ritual peyote ingestion, I want to consider as a final transformation in Kiowa religion. Even though Kiowas had knowledge of it from Native peoples living south of them, they did not begin to really experiment with the practice until the 1870s, and it didn't become common until the 1880s. But once it did, peyote rites offered some connections to older rituals aimed at prayer and healing. They occurred inside individual teepees among small groups of practitioners. So this is an image someone made. Of course, we can see inside the teepee, but normally no one outside of it would have been able to see what was happening inside. Gathered at night, the rites include praying, singing, drumming, ingesting peyote, and waiting for experiences such as visions or forms of healing. Of course, Kiowas were still trying to perform many of these acts at their annual Sundance, but Americans increasingly acted to stop the ceremony. Reservation agents sent Army officers to watch the Sundance or to stop it altogether. In the early 1880s, federal officials drew up a list of punishable offenses, which included sundancing. Peyote rites provided a format for seeking healing, vision, and blessing, while at the same time protecting practitioners from American scrutiny. The rites became more and more popular among Kiowas and appeared regularly in Kiowa art produced in this period. So instead of being part of these big communal celebrations that involved thousands of people, they moved their prayers for healing and blessing and empowerment into these smaller and not able to be viewed practices. And lots of artists in this period drew images of peyote throughout. And this brings me back to Croneck's peyote shield. If Kiowas had known about peyote for decades, and even found it powerful for decades, why had they not integrated it into their communal practice earlier? Why wait till the 1870s and 80s? The short answer is they didn't need it until then. Prior to that moment, their own traditions, which they had practiced for many decades, if not a few centuries, were all they needed. But the 1870s brought Quakers to the reservation. It brought soldiers who enforced order and cultural transformation. A leader rose up among them, but his rectification movement failed. Some Kiowas were exiled and imprisoned. Soldiers monitored the summer sundances with increasing frequency. And here we can see, this is a form of Kiowa record keeping in which they would note when they practiced a Sundance. This is the central pole in a Sundance lodge. This is an entry for 1875, right after the war, and there's an American soldier watching them practice. Under these new pressures, Kiowas considered the sacred power available from outside their own circles. Zotam affiliated with Christianity. He and others engaged peyote in ritual formats. Kiowa religion shifted, and over the next few decades, it was truly transformed. Kiowas accessed sacred power in an array of forms: peyote, Protestant and Catholic versions of Christianity, and eventually their own version of the Plains Indian ghost dance. With all of these new practices, though, Kiowas sought to preserve themselves as a people connected to each other and to a particular place. This common theme in Kiowa religion was confirmed in the 1890s when the U.S. government tried to allot their lands by breaking them apart into individual plots for ownership and selling off the excess to Americans. Kiowas of all ritual persuasions joined the legal battle to fight it: Christians, peyotists, ghost dancers, and in the case of Zotam, someone who did all three. So this is an 1893 petition to Congress, and it's got tons of Kiowa names, and some of them are Christian, some are ghost dancers, Some of them are trying to do Sundance things still in secret, but they all banded together to try to protect the land from being broken apart and sold off as surplus. At the beginning, I said that the struggle over Indian territory transformed people on both sides. And I told you one part of that story about Kiowas in the 1870s and the Quakers who came to administer their reservation. But this story of transformative encounter continued on through the rest of the century, and it intersected with other major developments in American religious life, including debates about religious identity and citizenship, what appropriate religion looked like in a modern world, the nature and fate of missions, and the place of Roman Catholics in American life. But as I argued in regard to the Quaker reservation workers, the struggle over Indian territory also challenged carefully constructed benevolent identities. Struggles over what it meant to be a friend of the Indian or a pacifist continued and could be seen in later relations between Protestant benevolent workers and other populations they sought to transform. I'm thinking most of the eventual American occupation of places like the Philippines. And in Indian country, religion, or at least ritual seeking for sacred power, proved to be crucial for Kiowa people struggling to hold on to each other and to their land. Thanks. I know there might be some folks who need to leave for class, but we're also going to take some time in a moment to have Q&A for those of you who would like to stay. And for those of you who have to go to class, thanks for coming. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
With your undergraduate degree in music, did you see any syncretism between the religious songs that the Kiowas sang and the Quakers, both in terms of melodies, language, etc.?
So Kiowas developed a very rich hymn singing tradition, which they actually continue into the present. There's a Kiowa Baptist church that I've attended several times, and they sing hymns created by Kiowa Baptists in the 1890s. They continue to sing those songs in Kiowa language. So there's a really rich musical tradition, but it doesn't really start until the Baptists arrive, because the Quakers don't sing, since they have silent worship. But once the Baptist church got going, the Baptist missionaries wanted to use music, or at least reframe how music was a part of experience, right? For instance, they didn't want any drumming to occur, but they did want Kiowas to sing, and so they encouraged one particular Kiowa Baptist to write songs. He wrote like dozens of Christian hymns in the Kiowa language, and they really became a kind of canon that continues to be used. And it's really interesting, the words that they use really, you can see the connections to traditional forms of power. So I talked about how they thought sacred power was this thing they called dodo. When they address the Christian God, they use that base word dodo, and they add another syllable to it. So they talk about, when they're praying, they say, aho, which means listen to me, doki. So they're using a part of that word for power that's always been a part of their language and adding a new word, meaning giving it a personified or father role. So it's got these connections, but it also has these really interesting differences. Yes?
I loved how you use material culture. I was curious how you first found the examples of shields and other things written on animal hides, but then also how you learned to interpret them in the way that Kiowa would as well.
It was a totally new experience for me, and it started, so one of the ways I got into this project was through an interest in the experience of incarceration. And this experience of incarceration kind of has become famous among art historians and anthropologists because all these Native artists who were incarcerated made a bunch of drawings, like hundreds and hundreds of drawings while incarcerated, and many of them have been preserved. And so anthropologists and art historians became really interested in how Native people were taking paper and colored pencils, but continuing artistic traditions that they had learned growing up among their own people. So it started with the drawings and learning about the drawings, and then realizing that to understand the drawings, you had to go back and look at this larger material culture that not only goes back to animal hides and teepees and shields, but actually goes back even further to rock art. So it required reading a bunch of anthropology and art history, which I had never done. And one thing that really helped was I made a relationship with a Smithsonian anthropologist who's a real specialist on Kiowa material culture, and I basically fact-checked everything with her, and she was very gracious about kind of working with me as I learned about the materials. And I think one of the reasons she wanted to do that is that this was a way to take those materials and make them part of a larger American story, and normally they had just been studied as just kind of material history of Plains Indians, very limited in terms of what people use them as sources for. So I was really lucky that she supported that process. It took a long time. It felt like learning a language. Kiowas had no written language in this period, but really to me, the material sources and learning how to understand them felt like learning this like material culture language. Yeah.
Did you find that when people had these prophetic experiences and then when nothing prevented the bullets from having their influence, did the Kiowa in some way have a crisis of faith about those traditions of receiving sacred knowledge?
So this is actually an ongoing story in lots of rectification movements, like what happens when the movement fails. Because in many, many cases, there are these moments that can be conceived of as failure, right? And goose flying overhead, I think, is one of those examples. And what that often meant, one of two things could happen. The rectification leader himself could say, we've done something wrong. Like perhaps we didn't purify ourselves properly, perhaps we didn't ritually prepare, perhaps we didn't all believe and affirm in this new vision strongly enough. So perhaps the problem was with the people. And some people were persuaded by that, because there's actually a number of rectification leaders that pop up in Kiowa history through this period. And people follow them anew. They make promises, some of which also fail. And some people are persuaded we've done something wrong because this vision hasn't come to pass. But often people also fall away from that, but they've got other traditions they can lean back on. Like if they don't necessarily go with this rectification leader, that doesn't mean for them that the Sundance has been undermined, or it doesn't mean that other kinds of healing or powerful people would be undermined. It just means this guy's vision didn't work. And that is actually in the literature across rectification movements. There's the flexibility kind of goes both ways. You can try new things when they work, and when something doesn't work, you can very simply turn to something else without it necessarily causing the whole system to crash. Yeah.
You talked about moving back and forth from one tradition to another. To what degree is there syncretism? That is, taking some aspects of one tradition and incorporating it into another one.
So I think there is a lot there. I think when I look at forms of Kiowa Christianity in this period and in the present, one of the things I see is Kiowa people taking Christian ideas, scriptures, practices, and placing them within their worldview. Yeah. And then, because that worldview is one in which you are a person without power. Things that have power are things you need to be humble before and address and request things from, and you make offerings to them and you make vows to them. And that is totally a part of Kiowa Christianity to this day. So the first time I went to this Kiowa Baptist church, there was a regular church offering, which happens in many Protestant churches, right? You pass the plate, people put their money in, but then there's a second offering. And in the second offering, you are invited to get up and say something very specific and make a very specific dollar amount pledge, right? And so the first time I was there, someone got up and said, my granddaughter has turned 5 years old and I'm going to give $5 and I'm going to continue to give $5 once a month this whole year until she turns 6. And that's a very specific form of offering and making a vow that looks just like the Sundance. Because that's how you approach power. You thank you thank powers for what they've done for you. You make this very specific pledge, and you continue to offer it in the future. So they have both. They have the regular old white Protestant, put the money in the plate, and then they have this very specific way of making a pledge and stating what powers have done for you. And it continued. And I was talking to my Kiowa friend about this, and I said, I find it really interesting you have these two offerings. And he's like, doesn't every church? And I'm like, no, no, they don't. That is not how your average white Protestant or white Baptist would operate. So I see a lot of coming together, or syncretism.
Did they ever incorporate peyote into Christian tradition?
It's a very uneasy, that's something about which people have real disagreement. So there are definitely people like Zotam, like all kinds of people like Zotam, who moved back and forth between Christian practice and peyote practice very smoothly. There were other people, including the guy who wrote that report, kind of telling on Zotam, who did not think this was a good idea, and who really found, and it's interesting, they had a different objection, I think, than white missionaries. Their objection was more that they didn't think peyote actually had power. It wasn't like the missionaries were like, this is drug use, this is nature worship, it's idolatry. Kiowa Christians who objected to peyote were more likely to say, it doesn't work. The Jesus way works, right? So just do the Jesus way. And that in some ways also gets to your question about like what works and what doesn't. And you should walk away from the things that don't work. Yeah.
On that same note, how would you describe the cultural interplay between the Kiowa tribe and their allies, the Comanche, and even between their rivals like the Lakota Sioux and Apache? How would you describe those cultural interactions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. One of the things that happened, and this is why it's actually, I think, really important to tell the kind of pre-colonial story of Native peoples. Often the way that Native peoples are brought into narratives about American history, they're brought in right before the colonial contact happens. And their long history of change over time is not really addressed. And Kiowas had this tradition of making alliances and learning new religious things through their long history of migration. And so when they get to the southern plains and become friends with the Comanche, they actually teach the Comanche the sun dance. It was something the Comanches hadn't done. And the Comanches are like, great, we'll do this too. So they ended up doing that together. Their two prophets worked together when they had kind of simultaneous rectification movements, and the two prophets worked together. So I think there's ways that they are informing one another for sure. And that was not considered that there were no issues with that. The flexibility of these systems allowed you to kind of learn new things from other Native people and also from Americans. And that flexibility had a long, long history. And one that Americans really struggled with when they met with Kiowas and with Comanches. And I think that's a great reason to kind of look at those long histories to see how long that flexibility has been in practice, centuries. Oh, and they do actually, they later make peace with the Lakota, and in the reservation period, the Lakotas actually come and make delegations. And one Kiowa man travels to the Lakota reservations to learn about the ghost dance in the 1890s. So they make peace eventually.
And that probably has to do with increased American tension. So there's this solidarity where all
absolutely
American natives, so we should bond together.
Yes, that's the creation of a pan-Indian alliance, kind of in these new kind of colonial encounter. When the Kiowas and the Sioux were enemies, there were no Americans nearby. But much later, there's great reason for them to interact with one another. Yeah.
The prisons obviously use militaristic behavior modification, okay? And obviously that became the pattern for boarding schools. Did the Quakers by then wash their hands of anything with the Indians?
We would have, I wish the answer was yes, but the answer is no. The Quakers love Fort Marion. Their newspapers are full of laudatory accounts of Fort Marion and laudatory accounts of Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which is founded by the person who ran Fort Marion. They love it. And for me, that was a very shocking historical find to just see, I would have expected at least a washing of hands or at least maybe a silence, but they applaud it. And not only Quakers, but also, who's the great abolitionist in American life in this period? Harriet Beecher Stowe. She loves Fort Marion. She writes all these laudatory newspaper articles about how awesome Fort Marion is, and then she's a supporter of Carlisle boarding school. So some people that we kind of really consider radical in certain ways in the cause of human freedom, in this story, they have a different approach. And for me, at least, that was I found that a sad part of researching this story. Yes?
Where do you stand now as far as the Christian one truth versus the Kiowa many truths?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I'm a Christian myself. I'm a Mennonite, and I grew up Mennonite and continue to be one. Went to a Mennonite college, and one of the things, I actually have a side project right now looking at Mennonite missions to the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation. I have learned a great deal from my contact with Kiowa people and the materials that are part of this project. And they, I have to say, have been transformative for me also. So maybe in the transformative title, I should put myself. This happens, I think, to historians and anthropologists sometimes when you're working with people and materials. It can kind of change who you are. When I first started this project, and I remember the first time I read about goose flying overhead, this man who talks to owls, like what? You know, what is this, talking to owls? I'm this Mennonite historian from the Midwest, and here's this guy talking to owls. But over the years and over my contacts with Native people, including people who still operate peyote meetings there, who move back and forth between Christianity and peyote, who are firm Christians themselves, I have come to see what they mean by power, and how power can be an unexpected, at least places I didn't expect it to be. That there might be power in animals, and there might be power in places. To my mind, that doesn't necessarily contradict my Christianity, because I think the Christian God could do that. But I might not have known that through just my own version of Christianity. I might not have seen that or experienced that before meeting my Kiowa friends. Does that help? That's a hard question to answer, but a real one.
All right, let's give her one more round of applause.
Thank you so much.